Guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Tuesday, August 1st, 2023. Happy August. Today we're going to be talking about the New York Times Siena College poll that was just released for the 2024 Republican Party nomination. A primary poll that was very accurate in the 2022 midterm elections. In many people's eyes, the gold standard of a political poll nationwide gives us a very general understanding, and actually not just general, but in-depth understanding of the Republican electorate and where they stand on a multitude of issues. Now, this video alone won't encompass everything that they asked about. There were 100 plus questions asked here, and a number of them that also show some very fascinating results when it boils down to issue by issue voting, when it boils down to candidate quality, what they look for in candidates. But we're going to be looking at some of the more major top lines that provide a bit more context as to how the Republican primary is going, and what's good news for candidates Donald Trump, Ron DeSantis, and bad news for many of the others. Now, the New York Times poll here has one major takeaway, that Donald Trump is leading by a very substantial amount. In fact, the headline following the release of such a fascinating poll was that Trump was crushing Ron DeSantis and GOP rivals. That was the headline. The main takeaway was that Donald Trump was leading, but we've known this for quite some time. The national average has Donald Trump at 54%, Ron DeSantis at 18%. The New York Times has, the FiveThirtyEight average has Donald Trump at 53%, Ron DeSantis at 16%. So roughly similar to what the New York Times poll is finding, but boiling down to a little bit deeper than that, we find even better results to take a look at. Numbers that might describe why voters are leaning towards Donald Trump over potential contenders despite the 2020 presidential election loss. Now, what we've done here is went ahead and I've highlighted some of the more important results, ones that I think are points of interest that show that Donald Trump's lead isn't just a lead fixated by the presidential election from 2020. It isn't just that they believe that Donald Trump is the rightful president. It's a lot more than that, a lot deeper and a lot more intense when it comes down to what matters to these Republican Party voters. Now, what we will see here is that some general questions that really don't provide us any more information than what we already know about the mainstream GOP. They don't approve of Joe Biden's, handling of the job as president. But what I do think is, though, they did ask some questions about RFK Jr., Ron DeSantis, Donald Trump even, where they question, do you have a very favorable view, somewhat favorable view, somewhat unfavorable, or very unfavorable? This is the type of questioning that they ask for other candidates. So for Donald Trump, his very favorable number was 43%. The somewhat favorable number being at 33%, with a combined total vote share here of 76% of Republican primary voters viewing Donald Trump in a positive way. That means on the baseline, the former president hasn't lost much support from his 88% approval, considering that he is now 3 years past no longer having the presidency. Now, for Ron DeSantis, as much as he is not necessarily the favorite amongst the GOP, his approvals are high as well. He has roughly 66% of the Republican Party viewing him favorably, somewhat, or very, with just 20% viewing him in an unfavorable manner. For Donald Trump, that number is 22%. You can see here that Ron DeSantis isn't exactly losing the Republican electorate the way that we might think. Some people are arguing that his dip in national polling data is as a result of his unfavorability, that Republicans are starting to dislike him. It's not necessarily that, but more so that they like Donald Trump more. As we will see here, they also have questions about Mike Pence, where you can see that the combined vote against Mike Pence here, roughly 45% of the Republican electorate sees Mike Pence in an unfavorable manner versus 44%. Roughly 1 in 2 Republicans still like Mike Pence, even if Donald Trump is receiving over half of the GOP vote. Meaning that this idea that these candidates are so unpopular on their side of the aisle might hold true for Mike Pence to an extent, but even then, it's only a plurality. It's not a majority. As much as we have seen the media say that Mike Pence has been ostracized by the GOP, which he has, it makes it seem as if that he is entirely pushed away from, which just isn't the case. Now, Robert Kennedy Jr., RFK Jr., we know him as the Democratic candidate for president who's running against Joe Biden, who's seen as this primary challenger against the incumbent president, who has a roughly 44% somewhat favorable rating amongst Republicans and a 9% very favorable rating. This is a good place to be if you're RFK Jr., if you're running in a Republican primary as a Democrat. But he isn't. He's running in the Democratic primary, which makes this a little bit more difficult to see why this matters. It doesn't mean that he's electable in the general election. I don't think that any of these Republican voters are going to say, I'm going to vote against practically all of my values and align with RFK Jr. on just some that they agree upon. I do not believe that this metric will matter, but it will be covered, and I think there will be some discussion about it, but we'll talk about it in other videos when it comes down to the Democratic primary. We're just not focused on that today. So let's go ahead and continue taking a look. We know this is a Republican-based. 94% of respondents say that they either align personally with the GOP, or if they are responding as an independent, that they will say that they align closer with the Republican Party, 94%. So talking about a very Republican electorate here. And some of the questions here, like I said, were some very baseline ones. Who do you support in 2024? Donald Trump at 54%, Ron DeSantis at 17%. The interesting takeaway from this poll, though, is that no candidate is above 3% besides those two. This is a two-man race, and it's starting to become a one-man race, with Donald Trump taking away the lead by such a significant amount. Sorry about that. I had to mute my microphone for just a moment. But you will see that with Donald Trump at 54, Ron DeSantis at 17, you start to realize that Donald Trump is about to outpace Ron DeSantis nearly 3-1. He's already doing better in terms of fundraising, and now he's on track to do significantly better in polls, and Ron DeSantis continues to drop. 17% is lower than every other poll taken just a month ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. The trend has been in decline for Ron DeSantis, whereas Donald Trump has plateaued or even increased, depending on where you're looking. Now, in terms of how candidates feel about those who they responded that they support in the last poll, the last question, as the New York Times asked it, 80% say they strongly support their candidate. This isn't some begrudging support for Donald Trump because they feel bad that he lost the last election. This is excitement around his campaign, similar to what we saw in 2016 and 2020. 80% of Republican respondents say they feel strongly today about who they support, that being President Donald Trump, in more cases than not. And we also see that of those who are voting for Donald Trump, 52% say they are only considering Donald Trump. Roughly half of that 54%, which you cut it in half, you're still ahead of Ron DeSantis, 52%, half of them say that they are only considering Donald Trump. What does that mean for a general election? Decreased enthusiasm should Donald Trump lose the nomination. Decreased support, or maybe even third-party support, depending on who the nominee is. While 46% say they are still considering other candidates, Donald Trump still leads with this 52%. Assuming that the remaining 46% splits in half for Donald Trump for somebody else in a bad situation for Donald Trump where he has lost half of that electorate and has to gain back half of it too, you're talking about Donald Trump still leading practically every way you see this going. Unless 100% of the considering other candidates abandon ship, which, newsflash, it's probably not going to happen, Donald Trump is still very much on track to win the primary. So right now at 52%, he is in a good place. And we also have this question here of those not voting for Donald Trump, 34% are considering Donald Trump in the primary. This is likely coming from those who support Ron DeSantis, support Donald Trump, but are narrowly in favor of Ron DeSantis for maybe issues of electability or, policy, whatever it might be. Donald Trump still gets 34% in consideration. You combine that together, and Donald Trump is not only, because he already is this, the undefeatable force. There is no pathway for a Republican victory that isn't in favor of Donald Trump in any of the primary states, should that become a reality. Even in states like Utah that have pushed back against Donald Trump in the past, even in states where Donald Trump isn't so popular or is polling down to Ron DeSantis, such as Wisconsin or Tennessee. Looking at the numbers now, Donald Trump is in a very, very good place, and you can see that in terms of overall candidate choices. Now, there is also this head-to-head poll that I think shows exactly why Donald Trump is, in every case, the presumptive nominee. The argument has been made even by myself, and I think there was some truth to it in the past, that if everybody dropped out and endorsed Ron DeSantis, they would have an opportunity to strike and take down Donald Trump for the first time ever. And for a while, I thought that was true. When Donald Trump's lead went down from 31% all the way down to just 18% in the matter of a week as a result of the 2022 midterms, and maintained itself to a point where it was even so close that on the 538 average, Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis were within 2 percentage points of each other, Donald Trump was in the race and Ron DeSantis was not. And at this point, we knew that Nikki Haley was going to be running. We had a general idea that Mike Pence was going to be running. And even as we got closer around this time frame, around March, we had a better idea and understanding that yes, Donald Trump is leading, but Ron DeSantis, again, is within that 10-point margin where he could strike. He could take down Donald Trump should he choose. Now that he is down 30%, it is incredibly difficult to see how Donald Trump loses the nomination. Ron DeSantis wins the nomination. It is very difficult to see how Donald Trump at this point in time can be dethroned, and this poll doesn't reaffirm any of the concerns or reaffirm any of the confidence that the Republican Party might have otherwise had in a head-to-head matchup. There were polls done in the past that showed Ron DeSantis defeating Donald Trump in the head-to-head matchup, but this gold standard poll that has matched the average of every single poll that has been released up until now, going into the mix, being very, very accurate, shows that 62% of respondents say if the choices were between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, they would back the former president. This is bad news. This is a 30-point loss for Ron DeSantis. It's a landslide of proportions, and it is a very embarrassing one, considering the history that showed Ron DeSantis a very possible pathway to becoming the Republican nominee if he played his cards correctly in the past. Obviously, things change because they did, but there was a point in time where this number would have been entirely different, which is exactly why I felt I needed to point it out in the first place. And just to that point, of those voting not for Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis, 29% say they are more likely to vote for Donald Trump. Just 47% say Ron DeSantis. If less than half of those already disillusioned with the top two are saying Ron DeSantis, you find yourself in a problem because Ron DeSantis needs these voters and Donald Trump does not, which means Donald Trump is in a very good position based off of all of these metrics. There is not one here that I would say comes across as alarming except for the general election, especially as we start to see these indictments start to roll in and roll in. But on the Republican side, in fact, I think it helps him, which is just crazy to think about. So we've gone through a lot of the headlines here that I wanted to, but one major takeaway that isn't as far up on this, so we're going to use the article about Trump crushing DeSantis. The reason for backing Trump shows exactly why it's going to be very difficult for DeSantis to try to dethrone him. As we can see from the New York Times, Republican primary voters see Donald Trump as a stronger, more electable choice. Now, we know that's wrong, or at least you might not agree with me, but at least I am saying that I believe this is an incorrect statement. I believe Ron DeSantis is more electable than Donald Trump. I think practically every other Republican on that ballot is. Because Donald Trump has those indictments. He has baggage. He has a lost election. He has lost 2 midterm elections. I mean, Donald Trump has been, in many ways, a poison to the mainstream Republican Party. Remember the red wave that was supposed to happen a year ago? Remember the landslide he was supposed to guarantee Republicans in 2020? Remember the blue wave that occurred in 2018? Looking at these numbers, I am fascinated that 58% of respondents believe that Donald Trump is more able to beat Joe Biden than Ron DeSantis. You find that primary voters see Donald Trump as more electable, as a stronger leader, as someone who can get things done. Quite frankly, more fun. These are things that these voters are backing Trump on, and it is really hard to make that argument now that Donald Trump is not more electable, because the argument has already been presented, and yet it doesn't seem to land. The argument that Ron DeSantis won a swing state by 20 points isn't hitting GOP primary voters the way that it should be. It is only benefiting Donald Trump, even though he only has one election to his name that was a success and continuous losses in 2018, 2020, and then 2022. Democrats are happy about this. They are happy that this idea that Trump is more electable is working on the GOP side, because they know that should a general election happen, they want to be running against the former president. We are in a fascinating time frame, but the New York Times Siena College poll provides a bit more insight as to the state of the race, the state of our national politics. And I'm very happy that they've released these numbers because they tell us a lot about the mainstream Republican Party, where they stand, why they're supporting Donald Trump, and exactly what we should expect to see in a head-to-head matchup in the eventual reality that these other candidates drop out. Honestly, newsflash here as well, it doesn't change much. Still a landslide victory for the former president, and honestly, we could have predicted this a month ago, 2 months ago, but when you look back further than that, we might have expected an entirely different Republican nominee. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.